Britain's forgotten champion of the people, Rochdale, the Co-op, Wigan and St Helens, when shopkeepers feared the workers' stores. Forgotten. And I think it's true that to a large extent, the Co-op has been forgotten. What I'm going to demonstrate to you tonight is that, in actual fact, the Co-op was a colossus. In its day, it struck fear into the hearts of its shopkeeper competitors. So much so that in the late 19th century, there was a running battle between the cooperative movement and organised shopkeepers across the UK. Now, before I sort of get into the nitty-gritty, just 3 people who should be here tonight. 3 people who should be here tonight. They might learn something, actually. Well, take Greg Wallace, first of all, and not for the usual reasons. Back in 2010, Greg Wallace basically led a BBC series called The High Street. And this was set in Shepton Mallet, and it was one of these reality shows where they basically follow a series of shops over 10 years throughout history, etc. And this had great pretensions for being very educational. There was an educational website and all the rest of it. No mention of the Co-op. The Co-op only appeared when somebody in one of the stores had to go and buy some milk, and they went to the Co-op. Well, we were quite intrigued by this, so we did a little bit of research on Shepton Mallet, and it turned out that Shepton Mallet, from the 1860s, had the biggest cooperative in Somerset, probably in the southwest of England at the time. And in the 1860s, there were continual complaints by shopkeepers about the fact that they were being massively outcompeted by the Co-op. Now, we sent all this to the BBC. We're still waiting for a reply. I'm not holding my breath. And then we get this fella over here, one of my favourite television presenters, Peston, fantastic coverage, produces this wonderful, wonderful sort of series on the origins of the supermarket. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's wrong, but it's absolutely fantastic to watch. Why is it wrong? Because he says that Sainsbury's invented the supermarket. The Co-op invented the supermarket. Actually, it was a cooperative in London, the Royal Arsenal, that opened the first supermarket, self-service supermarket, actually during the Second World War. Alice Roberts, wonderfully. I remember back in 2021, I think it was, she did one of those marvellous kind of archaeology programs that she does. And she went to Rochdale. And of course, at the time, they were digging everything up at Rochdale because they were making massive sort of changes. And she basically said, we're going to take a look at the industrial history of Rochdale. And she sort of made reference to the town hall, etc. And they talked about what they found. And she didn't actually mention the Co-op. At the end, she said, at least we've seen something of the small contribution that Rochdale has made to the modern world. Well, by this time, I'm throwing things at the television. I'm throwing things at the telly. Because in actual fact, what started in Rochdale has ballooned to today to a movement of 6 billion people around the world. There are 6 billion people on this planet who are members of co-ops. Lots of different types of co-ops, workers' co-ops, producer co-ops, consumer co-ops, which is what we usually think of when we think of the co-op here, credit unions. 2025 is the United Nations year of the cooperatives. It's actually a year in which the United Nations are promoting cooperatives actively because cooperatives have such a strong reputation in terms of redistributing wealth much more equally. Now, if you spoke to most people in Britain, and this is the place where the movement really begins, you speak to most people out there, there is no awareness of that. Very, very little awareness. I remember when we wrote the first book on the co-op a number of years ago, we interviewed a guy called Graham Melmock, who was the chief exec of the Cooperative Wholesale Society back in the mid-90s. And there was an attempt to actually take over the co-op by a consortium of robber barons, I would call them, from the City of London. And Melmoth said he was called to the Sunday Times' offices in London to discuss this. And the opening welcome he got from the journalist concerned was, "Oh, you're from the co-op, are you? Where's your cloth cap and your whippet?" Now, this sort of stuff is actually, it's funny, but in a way, it's not funny. Because what's tended to happen is a very important part of working class history in Britain has been gradually erased, has been gradually forgotten. And not all of this is accidental, I would argue. The fact is that by 1914, and this is one of the co-op's own sort of posters, it is a colossus of commerce. It is a global entity. It's a global player by 1914. It's got plantations, tea plantations in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it's known today, in India. It's got a major branch in New York, right in the middle of New York. It's buying fruit, dried fruit, all over Europe. It's a global entity. It's a global player. It's got a major place for buying palm oil and cocoa in West Africa. It's an absolute giant. And the shopkeepers were terrified of it. It knocked them for six. And the first half of tonight's session is to look at how that came to be, how that came to pass. So I'm going to say something about why the Rochdale Pioneers were established, what consumer cooperatives were all about. I'll tell you about the principles on which Rochdale was based, on which the whole of the consumer movement in Britain came to be based, how and why consumer co-ops grew and multiplied. And I'll talk about the emergence of the cooperative wholesale societies, organizations that actually supplied many of the local co-op societies. And I'll say something about the enemies of cooperation. And part of that will look at the battle between the co-ops and the shopkeepers and private capitalists in 1902, 1903. To understand why the cooperative movement came into existence, you need to really think back to what life was like in early industrial Britain in the early 19th century. And it's a pretty grim picture. Bad housing, overcrowded towns, no proper sanitation. Disease is rife. If you go to Liverpool and go behind the Anglican Cathedral, there's a park there, which is actually an old graveyard. And there's a monument there that really captures, in a very moving way, what life was actually like. It's actually a list of deaths from the local orphanage in 1841. And it's a list of children, girls mainly, who died of cholera in 1841, 1842. There's about 50 or 60 names. And you've got the age of the children, 2, 4, 6, 7. That's what life was like at the time. Life is cheap, often short, and very brutal. There's no real medical care. And what welfare there is pretty Spartan and often feared. You've all heard of the workhouse. The other thing that's often overlooked is just how unreliable and how bad food supplies were. In many of the fast-growing towns and cities, the supply of food struggled to keep up with the needs of people. And this allowed many shopkeepers basically to rip their customers off. And this is why in 1844, there are a group of people who will do something about it. Now, one of the things that's quite important to understand is that as an idea, cooperation isn't just something that really captured the minds of the working class. Quite a few middle-class intellectuals in the 19th century are fascinated by this idea of setting up cooperative communes in which people could essentially break away from capitalist society and run their own farms, their own organizations. People like William King, Robert Owen, and there's a picture here of New Lanark Mill where Robert Owen basically managed a mill up in Scotland. Very idealistic, the idea of breaking away from society, setting up communes of people. Ultimately, it wasn't very successful. These ideas really never really worked. There are various attempts to set up communes. All of them fail. And then something interesting happens in 1844. You get the establishment of the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. Wonderful name, isn't it? Basically, it was in response to crisis, in response to hardship. The 1840s were often referred to as the hungry 40s. A lot of unemployment, a lot of poverty. There's a major strike in Rochdale of the cotton operatives. And basically, a big problem is bad and expensive food. Now, there are some workers in Rochdale who have a little bit of political experience. The 1830s had been a very radical decade, and many of these people who set up the Rochdale Pioneers were people who had been active in trying to win the vote and in some of the early trade unions that were set up in the 30s. Many of them were Chartists who supported votes for all and wanted to prove that working people were fit to have the vote and that they were able to run their own affairs. So what did these people do? Well, ultimately, they set up shop in Toad Lane, now the museum, of course. The picture of the Rochdale Pioneers you can see there are several points I'd make about it. First of all, it's incredibly sexist because quite a few women were involved in the establishment as well. The other thing is that they look a right miserable bunch, don't they? In actual fact, there are 2 points to make here. First of all, if you had your photograph taken in the 1860s, you weren't allowed to smile because it took so long to take the picture, you see. The second thing is that this picture was actually taken in 1865, 20 years after the Pioneers were set up. So these were actually very young men. These were people who were in their 20s, in one or two cases, their teens when they actually set this up, which makes it, I think, even more remarkable. And basically, they opened their first store in this building we can see here in Toad Lane. And they set up a series of principles, a structure that really took off, that everybody copied. The Rochdale Pioneers were what we call a consumer cooperative. It's a cooperative that is about basically selling things to people, supplying people with essentials like groceries and food. Basically, members are consumers. If you're a member of a cooperative, then you buy from the co-op and you're rewarded for that. The key thing is that it's a democratic business. One member, one vote. Not like a private company where if you own 51% of the shares, you basically control the company. It doesn't work that way. One member, one vote. So it's purely democratic. Dividends are paid to members reflecting the amount that they buy from the co-op. So if you shop regularly at the co-op store, you basically get more in terms of a dividend. Hence the famous divvy number that everyone can remember. It helped many families to save. For many families in the mid-late 19th century, it was the way they saved, by saving the divvy up. It was also a very effective way of spreading wealth around. Initially, they wouldn't actually use credit, though that changed in due course. They would only trade for cash. And the reason was they thought that they wanted to get working class people away from this situation where they were so dependent on credit that the shopkeepers basically owned them. It was about breaking that. And they were committed from the outset of providing good quality food at affordable prices. Now, this is no small matter. This is no small matter in the 19th century. Food has very little regulation in the 19th century. Some of the practices are dreadful. They use arsenic in certain foods, lead to make the bread whiter, things like that. And of course, lots of instances of people getting very, very sick. Remember, these people are poor. These people are poor, they're prone to disease. If their diet is bad, this is a matter of life and death. It's not a matter of, a consumer choice, Tesco or Lidl. This is a matter of life and death. And in that respect, what the co-op movement does is it addresses one of the most important issues of the time. From the outset, they were committed also to helping the wider community and helping members. They were committed to education for all. Many people actually learned to read and write, learned commercial skills from the local co-op society that they were members of. It had a great educational function. It set up reading rooms and libraries when no such things really existed in most places. They became hubs of the local communities. Now then, it's successful. Its membership doubled within a year or two. And by the time you get to the end of the 1850s, it counts its members in thousands. And it's a wealthy organization by then. It's selling enormous amounts of groceries to its members and the public in general. So much so that others decided to copy the model. And what you find happens in the 1850s and the 1860s is what I call the measles phenomenon. And to understand what I mean by this, we'll take a look at this. Each little spot you can see represents a co-op society. And as you can see, in 1860, we've got a bad case of measles already with all these societies, but it's even worse in 1870. The disease has spread. So these societies spread across the country like wildfire. They're all independent societies, or they're all independent organizations. When people say, oh, the co-op society, as though it's one society, that's not the case. Co-ops were local organizations run by local people, feeding very much into the local community. And what you find is that as the co-ops become more successful, so their premises become more elaborate. This is a picture of the Huddersfield sale room in about 1865. At the time, it's quite impressive. But all of the major, certainly northern towns, have cooperative stores that have a physical presence, that actually say, we are working class people and we matter. That's what they say. That's what these architectural edifices actually point out. The other thing that's quite important is the establishment of what they call the cooperative wholesales. Wholesalers, of course, are people who sell the goods to shops to sell on to the individual consumer. And one of the reasons why you got cooperative wholesales being set up in England and Scotland in the 1860s is that as early as the 1850s and the early 1860s, a bit of pushback happens from the local shopkeepers. They started to grumble and complain because the co-ops are very successful in actually winning business. And so what you find is that from the 1850s, 1860s, we hear stories of local shopkeepers approaching local private wholesalers and putting pressure on them not to sell to the co-op or not to sell the best goods to the co-op. And we also start to see a situation where pressure is put on employers. So if an employer basically employs people who are members of the co-op and are active in the co-op, that employer will be persuaded to sack them, to get rid of them. Now, very, very quickly, the cooperative movement realized that this could be really a very, very serious threat to the business. So what do? Well, what they do is they create new types of cooperatives, the cooperative wholesale societies. These are what are sometimes called secondary co-ops. They're co-ops, but their members aren't individual people. Their members are local co-op societies. And the principles are the same. Those local co-op societies pay in terms of subscriptions. They buy a share in CWS and they get a share, they get a dividend from the CWS based upon the amount that they actually buy from the cooperative wholesale societies. Now, these become very, very important indeed. These become very big players, especially the English cooperative societies. A couple of things to say here, really. to understand the dynamics that goes on here. I think if you understand the dynamics, you realise why the cooperative movement really is so successful. Co-op societies can buy from whoever they want. They don't have to buy from the cooperative wholesale societies. It's an option. They don't have to. And many local societies don't buy everything from the wholesales because they want a certain amount of local trade, because sometimes they can get things cheaper locally, and they want to keep quite a few local wholesalers sweet. There's a kind of political calculation here as well. So basically, they want to supply what members want, and they keep local suppliers on side where they can. But they will support the CWS if the price is right. One of the things that's important to understand about the British movement is that it is very, very hard-headed. This is not idealism. This is not setting up fancy communes. This is a movement that will survive and succeed in the marketplace. It is hard-headed in a way that I think Robert Owen and some of the early idealists were a little bit shocked by. Now, the wholesale society situation is quite interesting. They can't sell to private firms. They're not allowed to sell to private firms, though we'll see there's sometimes made an exception to that. They want, of course, to be the main, if not the sole supplier to co-op societies. And throughout the 19th century, there's a kind of constant row between the local societies and the wholesales because the local societies aren't loyal enough, etc. But the effect on this is that very quickly, the wholesales realise that if they're going to win the custom of the co-op societies, they had better be good. They'd better be good at providing the best quality produce at the lowest possible price. And that is what the wholesales proceed to do. This arrangement becomes an engine for growth, and it really is quite impressive. By the 1870s, you could already see the bones of a commercial empire. By the 1870s, the wholesales are starting to set up their own factories. There's a picture here of Crumsell, the confectionery works in Manchester. That's followed by all kinds of other stuff as well. New York, I want to say something about this. The picture that you can see next to New York is the Produce Exchange, very famous building in New York, built in the 1870s, opened in 1875. I believe it was demolished in the 1950s, actually. Well, basically, its job was to trade in all of the commodities that the American economy produces. And we're talking here about meat, wheat, butter, cheese. We actually imported a lot of cheese from America, believe it or not, in the 19th century. Now, what's interesting is that the first organization to actually rent accommodation in that building was the Cooperative Wholesale Society from Manchester. And the guy who was the local CWS representative, a man called John Gledhill, what we find is that he becomes a manager for the actual produce exchange itself. So he's not just living there, he's not just occupying commercial premises, he's actually helping to manage the exchange. Well, if you think about this for a couple of minutes, you realise this guy is in touch with every major producer in the country, in the United States. He's in touch with all of them. And he's so successful at cutting deals that by the time you get to the 1880s, you've got private firms knocking on the Cooperative Wholesale Society's door saying, well, will you buy for us as well? And initially, the CWS won't do this, but it makes some exceptions because it realises that if it can buy in even greater bulk, it has more leverage in terms of really driving prices down. It's tremendously powerful. In 1892, one of the directors of the Cooperative Wholesale Society, a man called William Bates, went to America to inspect the Cooperative Wholesale Society's activities. And he left this wonderful diary that's in the Cooperative Archive, day-by-day diary. And right from he arrives in New York. What's the first thing he does? He goes on the rides in in the Great Fairground in New York. And he says he had a great time. And then he travels around the country. As he goes around the country, he's buying stuff everywhere. He eventually comes back to Washington. In Washington, he's ushered into the White House to meet the American president. That's how important the CWS is as a customer to the American economy. Can you imagine the current CEO going to see Donald? That would be quite interesting, wouldn't it? So from that point of view, it's a quite remarkable sort of story. They have their own ships. They have their own shipping line. The first ship to go up the Manchester Ship Canal was a co-op ship. It's the first one. Some of the major properties around the Manchester Ship Canal were actually co-op warehouses and co-op organisations. And they're sourcing stuff from all over the world. New York, Copenhagen, tea plantations. All over the world, they're a global organisation. They're a multinational cooperative. Not a multinational company, a multinational cooperative with real global interests. They have their own bank. The CWS has its own banking department, which later comes to be known as the Co-op Bank. There's also a co-op building society, the Cooperative Permanent Building Society, which used to lend money to working class people to buy their houses. And what they would do is they would approach the manager of the local co-op society to check if you were creditworthy. So there's actually this kind of collaboration between the Co-op Permanent Building Society and local co-op societies. Co-op Permanent Building Society is still with us. It's this little organisation called the Nationwide now. Changed its name in 1970. You see what I mean about this being very, very big? You find also that it vertically integrates its activities. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it tries to do is it tries to get right down to dealing with the individual producer. In some cases, this means the Cooperative Wholesale Society itself actually buying things like farms and growing its own food. More often, it means dealing directly overseas with the local farmers rather than the local merchants. Copenhagen, 1881. The CWS opened a branch there. You think, well, why Copenhagen? Denmark is the largest supplier of butter at the time. Mainly because most of the Danish butter producing industry is cooperatively owned. So actually buying butter in Copenhagen is a very, very smart move. High quality, much demand in Britain. The guy they send there to set up the branch upsets all the local merchants because he says, yes, I'll buy stuff off you, but I'm not just going to buy from you. I want to speak to the farmers. I want to buy directly from the farmers. And there's a great furore over this. They try to boycott the Cooperative Wholesale Society, but they back down in the end because it's such a big organisation. They can't afford to ignore it. In actual fact, it was never the intention to buy everything from the farmers. The intention was to demonstrate to the merchants that if they played rough with the CWS, their CWS would play rough back. Which is also why they got into tea plantations. Because basically they were being ripped off by tea factors in London. And they said, right, what we'll do is we'll buy our own plantations. We realise they won't be able to supply our enormous demand for tea, but it won't upset a few private tea producers because the threat is always there that we can expand production. You see what I mean about being hard-headed and ruthless? You know, the co-op movement isn't cuddly in the late 19th century, especially if you're a private shopkeeper. They are ruthlessly efficient. They actually have some of the most sophisticated supply chains in the world. and private shopkeepers are terrified of them. I love these pictures. Yeah, see, these are actually pictures of the down at the bottom here at the top right. The pictures taken in 1913 when the CWS set up its branch in Sierra Leone in Freetown. And as you can see, it's quite imperial, really, when you look at it. I love this. This is actually from a slightly later period. These are special kind of advertising cards, but they make an important point. Tea picking on English and Scottish joint CWS plantations, shipped across, blended by the CWS, and sold in the co-op. In other words, what they're saying in that is we own everything from the picking of the leaf off the tea bush right to actually selling it to the consumer. Now, this is a strategy that is ferociously successful. You find nothing like this really in the private sector until you get into the 30s and the post-Second World War period. They really are an enormously sort of enterprising organisation. This is the CWS and the Manchester Ship Canal, SS Pioneer, the first co-op ship up there. The guy you can see down there, J.T.W. Mitchell, he was one of the early bosses of the Cooperative Wholesale Society. Lived with his mother in a terraced house in Rochdale up till his death. He's probably one of the great unsung entrepreneurs of the 19th century. One of the great unsung entrepreneurs. You know, think what? Alan Sugar, except with morals. In that respect, you know, these are absolute giants, but they're largely being forgotten. This is the Co-op flour mill on the Manchester Ship Canal, built in 1906. And the whole country's full of these buildings. The whole country's full of them. You'll probably recognise these because these buildings still stand today. The old Co-op Wholesale Society building right by Victoria, the old Cooperative Insurance Society building, it's still there. They call it the Cooperative Quarter. It's an absolute giant in that respect. And these are some of the stuff that they actually produce and some of the works that they have. The Earlham Soap Works, built in 1894. The various Earlham Dry Soap, CWS Bath Cubes, and I love the one in the middle, CWS Parrot Food. It's astonishing the amount of stuff that they actually produce. I mean, they are really very, very big players indeed. Now, inevitably, the resistance from private shopkeepers grows because they feel very, very sort of threatened by all this. Many regarded cooperative membership, especially the dividend, as a kind of unfair trading. They could never actually spell out why, but they thought it was unfair. There was something dodgy about it. And increasingly, we find in the late 19th century, private traders are organising to try to undermine local societies and to try to get wholesalers to try stop selling to local societies. And in some cases, as we said earlier, they even try to get co-op activists sacked. So what happens with this battle between the co-ops and the private shopkeepers? This is a wonderful example. I'm not going to read this out. You can read it on YouTube later on, but it's an example of the kind of things that employers and shopkeepers try to do. This is actually from Maryport. It's a cooperative news report from May 1886. What it says basically is about is a group of shopkeepers in Maryport put pressure on the local railway company, the Maryport and Carlisle, to discipline its workers and make them buy things from the private shop instead of the co-op. And the Maryport and Carlisle tell them where to go because they do so much business for the co-op society that they're not going to cut their own faces. But it's a wonderful kind of example of it. The cooperative news is wonderful. It's still going today. It's a shadow of its former self, but in the 19th century, the Co-op News, it was set up in 1870. It's a weekly publication. I sort of think of it as a kind of intellectual version of The Guardian, really. It's like The Guardian, except with brains. Seriously, the quality of journalism is stunning, actually. It really is. It's a fantastic source. Anyway, moving on. The resistance grows. By the 1860s and the 1870s, there's a national journal which had been established, the Grocer, again, still exists today, and it is constantly lobbying against the co-ops, saying the co-ops are engaged in unfair trading. And by the end of the 19th century, things really, as they say, kick off. In 1896, there's a boycott in Glasgow by the master fleshers, the butchers, the wholesale butchers, and they refuse basically to sell to co-op societies. And it becomes a big legal case. And in the end, the co-op wins. It beats them down. But the bitterness spreads across the country. And so we find, by the time we get to 1902, 1903, the resistance has spread to St Helens and Wigan. It kicks off in St Helens first, interestingly. The local society was boycotted by a new organisation of local traders, the Local Traders Defence Association. They basically boycotted supplies of manufacturers to the St Helens Society. They got local employers to refuse jobs to co-op society members. And it becomes a big issue. It becomes a really major issue. Now, the St Helens sort of boycott gets quite a lot of coverage. It's actually not terribly successful. Because in simple terms, many employers are very reluctant to get drawn into what they see as the self-interests of local shopkeepers. A similar effort is made in Wigan, and in Wigan it's a bit more successful. Because what they managed to do in Wigan was not just get the shopkeepers together, they got some of the mine owners as well involved in this. And there are instances of people being sacked because they're members of the local co-op society. What's interesting is that the co-op fights back. You find that in both St Helens and Wigan, week after week, there are counter demonstrations, counter meetings, and in the end, the co-ops hold their own. In the end, the resistance dies down. Ultimately, it's defeated. Now, this is actually a picture of the St Helens stores. And it really sort of goes back to what I said earlier about how co-op stores became a very physical, very visible emblem of working class power and dignity. And of course, if you're a private shopkeeper and you're up against that, you are going to be rather worried. You are going to be rather concerned. This is some of the co-op news. It's September 1902. Circulars being sent to all shopkeepers and mill owners and foundry masters, even to brewers and publicans, appealing to them to identify themselves with the so-called policy of self-protection. I mean, one of the reasons why there was so much hostility to co-op societies is that the cooperative movement by the late 19th century is saying, well, actually, the cooperative movement is the logical way to organise business. That actually private trade and private business is not terribly successful. So for many of the private shopkeepers, it wasn't just the competition they were worried about. For them, the co-op societies were an existential threat. They seemed to pose a real threat that it would eventually eliminate private business. Now, we know that didn't happen. But in the 1890s, it looked to many businesses that was a real possibility. That's why so much of the hostility was so intense. In a sense, it's a measure of sort of the extent to which the co-op was successful. It's interesting in Wigan, one of the things they got the coal owners on side with, because some of the Wigan Co-op Society bought Welsh coal. It cut a deal with a Welsh pit, and it got the coal cheap. So the Wigan coal owners weren't terribly happy about that. which is one of the reasons why they jumped onto the boycott. But this is really a kind of this is why the boycotts basically were called and why they didn't succeed. Both the St. Helens Society and the Wigan Society have been growing exponentially, both in terms of members and in terms of trade, for a number of years. And the measure of the fact that the boycotts were unsuccessful was the fact that that growth continued, regardless of the boycotts. They were totally ineffective. They lost. And this was a kind of a comment about St. Helens, the home of the boycott. Cooperation flourishing. In fact, many cooperators believed that in actual fact, the local shopkeepers did them a favour because they drew attention to just how effective the co-op societies were. So they end up actually recruiting people for the co-op societies inadvertently. This is quite interesting. I mean, this is just an example of how what the co-op sort of did. This is an article about the infamous Maypole pit disaster of 1908, and the co-op plays an important part in terms of raising money for relief, etc. And you find that sort of thing happens again and again with the co-ops locally. They become quite strongly embedded in local communities. But the battle carries on. I mean, this is a cartoon that really talked about an attempt on Manchester City Council to ban cooperative representatives from being councillors. So it really does carry on. This is 1909. And indeed, some of the battles went on. I mean, there's an almighty battle between Lever Brothers and the co-op movement, the CWS, which eventually goes to the House of Lords. I mean, basically, it concerns Sunlight Soap. Sunlight Soap, of course, big seller for Lever Brothers. CWS produces its own brand of soap, which is in competition. Lever's very sophisticated, national advertising, special price scheme, etc. And many co-op societies opt to buy Sunlight Soap rather than CWS soap initially because it's just better known. And their members are saying, no, we want to buy Sunlight Soap. And in the 1890s, this competition intensified. 1894, large new soap complex opened for CWS at Earlham in Manchester. And in the same year, Lever became a publicly owned company. And when it became a publicly owned company, what Lever tried to do was to persuade the CWS to buy shares in it. Because if they bought shares in it, then they thought, well, the CWS will back off then. It won't compete with us. But CWS refused to play that at all. And certainly, by the time we get to the 1890s, the competition becomes more and more intense. They produced new products, Lifebuoy soap. Do you remember Lifebuoy soap? That was Lever Brothers, 1890s. Lux soap flakes. And indeed, in the 1890s, they tended to succeed. But there's a problem by the 1890s in that an essential component of soap production was palm oil. And palm oil is in demand for all kinds of things in the 1890s, all kinds of industrial processes, production of margarine, etc. And there's a kind of shortage of palm oil, which is why both Lever Brothers and the CWS set up branches in West Africa so they can actually source palm oil direct. What's very interesting, Lever sought to get the leading soap manufacturers to fix prices, set up a cartel. And the idea was that if they did this, they wouldn't have to spend so much on advertising. And rather foolishly, Lever decided to suddenly cut a contract for advertising worth £6,000, a lot of money in the 1890s, with the Daily Mail. Well, if you pick a fight with the Daily Mail, you've got some problems. And the Daily Mail basically retaliated by launching a major campaign against what it called the Soap Trust. And what happened? It was very effective. It produced a huge boost for Cooperative Wholesale Society sales. And in 1908, CWS opened another soap plant, this time at Silvertown in London. And we find between 1905 and 1910, many co-op societies switched to seedless soap and actively refuse to stock lever products. Well, basically, lever went completely bananas and took them to court and said, this is unfair trading. The CWS pulled all of its financial resources out and lever was defeated. But it left a very, very clear concern among cooperators that they were now facing some very, very formidable opponents, very serious enemies, some people who could really do damage to them. And basically, the First World War in 1914 brought change. But that, as they say, is another story. Thank you very much.